Alright, now let's write the equation based off the graph. We just talked extensively about writing the graph based off the equation. So now we're going to try to kind of reverse engineer our equation. So this, at first glance, you might say it's a sine graph, but it really depends on where you start. If you start here, it could be a cosine graph shifted, or if you start here, it could be a negative cosine graph reflected, or shifted to the left. Or maybe it's a sine graph that got shifted too. So there's really an infinite amount of equations that you could write. So it says write a sine and a cosine equation. So let's start off with the sine one because that seems to be the easiest because it starts on the y-axis. Alright, so we'll use that part there. Now, if we look, it looks like we have a sinusoidal axis at 1 and an amplitude of 2. Okay, each box is about half a unit. So starting off, we see that we have y equals 2, positive 2, because it starts in the middle and goes up, times the sine of bx minus c, but I'm not going to write that because it wasn't shifted, so we know that c is 0, plus 1. Alright, now we have to find b. So normally we use period equals 2 pi over b to find the period. Now we're going to look at the graph to find the period and use that to figure out what b is. Alright, so it's not 100% clear by looking quickly at the graph what the period is. But if we look at these 2 points, those are 2 minimums. So the distance on the x-axis between those 2 points would represent the period. So if we subtract these two, we see that the period is pi. Okay, so we could plug that in and then cross multiply, and we get that b is equal to 2. So our one equation that would model this graph here is y equals 2 times the sine of 2x plus 1. Okay, now let's do it again, but using a cosine graph. So why don't we start here? Alright, and so now since the amplitude is still 2 and the sinusoidal axis is still 1, but since it's reflected, because we're starting at the minimum, alright, it's going to be negative 2 times the cosine of b. Alright, the period is still pi, so b is still going to be 2, so 2x minus c, and then plus 1. Alright, so now we have to figure out what c is. Now normally we would take what's inside the parentheses and set it equal to 0 to find our starting point. And normally we would know what c is, but we don't. Alright, but if we did know what c is, we could find what x value to start at by solving for x. Now, since I chose to start at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug in negative pi over 4 in for x, because that represents our starting point. Alright, that's where we're starting our graph. We're basing it off that point because it's a negative cosine graph. Alright, so instead of solving for x, we're going to solve for c, and we're going to plug the starting point in for x. Alright, so we get negative pi over 2 equals c. So that is what c is. So we have to plug that in there. And since it's a double negative, that's going to end up being 2x plus pi over 2. And so that would be the second equation. Alright, and that's pretty much how you do it. It's kind of the same idea. And then refer back to this for the little things that you might need help with, like finding the starting point or finding b, the period. I have a feeling the amplitude and d are probably a little easier.